Let's talk through another huge wave of Imperial Guard leaks. We've got some fancy relics and some punchy stratagems, including some rather fun overcharged last cells. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking more Guard, and over the past week or so we've been covering leaked details from the Codex that have come out through the leaks from Mordian Glory. Mr. Mordian Glory's excellent Guard channel has been keeping the content coming. He seems to have access to a full playtester copy of the Codex rules. First we had most of the rules section from the Codex, then last week a whole ton of the datasheets and points values attached, and now we've got a bunch more relics and more importantly the stratagems. Definitely a very important section of the Codex, and without them it was kind of hard to piece the bits together. As always, the usual disclaimer with the information: it's an early playtest copy of the Codex, so some stuff will almost certainly change, particularly points costs or maybe command points for stratagems if they think things are over or underpowered. The vast majority and the general thrust of the rules though should be accurate, and it serves pretty nicely to give us a taster of what's to come. As always, I'll leave a link down to the original source down in the video description. I certainly recommend checking out Mordian Glory, a great Guard channel that I'm sure will keep the Astra Militarum content coming both before and after the Codex drops. Probably the most interesting of the leaks today though are the stratagems. It does seem that there's some really useful ones added in, but a fair few of perhaps the old favourites have gone away. There does tend to be a bit of turnover with stratagems when new versions of the Codex comes out. A few old favourites stay, but some new ones crop up. As for losses on the stratagem front, a few really quite nice damage dealing ones do appear to have disappeared. Hail of Fire was quite a popular one for tanks taking out vehicles. That one's gone away. Vengeance of Acadia, I think that not many people will be surprised that that one goes. 4 rerolls against Chaos just for 1 CP was a bit of a screw you to that particular army. And a few other ones do seem to have disappeared as well. Inspired Tactics for an extra order, Take Cover for the extra +1 to your save even in the open, and a fair few of the other ones from Psychic Awakening as well, and seemingly most of the regimental stratagems as well, as it seems they're going to work pretty differently in the actual final Codex release. Perhaps not great for Cadians in particular, as they might well be losing overlapping fields of fire. As for what is actually here though, first up we have Relentless, 1 or 2 CP to count on top profile for vehicles. It's 2 CP for Titanics but 1 CP for regular tanks. That one's pretty handy to have it staying, to be honest, with guard tanks degrading to hit on 6s, then hitting on 4s is a massive damage boost. Seems like that could be pretty efficient on the Rogue or Dawn. For 1 CP we've got Field Promotion. That's quite a fun fluffy one where if your Warlord gets killed, another officer gets to be promoted to your Warlord, and they get to generate a Warlord trait that's most helpful at the time. Maybe a bit of a niche one, as you don't really want to ideally get your Warlord killed early if you can manage it, but maybe if you had your Warlord something exposed like a tank commander, it could be quite nice to have someone ready to take up the reins and get a situational Warlord trait when they die. For 1 or 2 CP, there's quite a fun one called Vengeful Salute. This one means that you get to shoot in death with a turret weapon at ballistic skill 5+. That sounds really quite nice if you say you had a battle tank or a demolisher taken out. Hopefully just fire off a bunch of extra shots at the enemy before it goes, maybe try and kill something important that was just about to inflict damage. It looks like it'll be 2 CP for super heavies, which is perhaps understandable given their enormous damage profiles. One thing I do wonder with this though is whether or not the turret weapon special rule would still come into effect, so whether or not after the +1 to hit it might actually be a 4+ that you hit on rather than a 5. I think we'd have to see the actual formal text for the stratagem to work it out. That one does seem really quite nice though. If you're running a tank company, then this could be something that could make shooting down Lehman Russes a bit of a worrying thing for your opponent in their turn. For 1 CP it's pretty cool to see the return of Crush them. You can use this on battle tanks or super heavies, and they count as weapon skill 4 in melee, so a bit worse than the weapon skill 2+ that it is at the moment. Though if you have the armoured keyword and it goes to a weapon scale of 3+, I'd guess that might be the armoured tracks upgrade. I guess it's not impossible, it could be Dozer Blades, and on top of that, wound rolls of a 6 deal 1 mortal wound in addition to normal damage. To be honest, that was quite a fun stratagem already. That could actually be pretty useful, particularly on things like Bane Blades with those adamantium tracks having high strength and damage too. The mortal wounds on top just seems really quite nice, gives you a pretty reasonable chance of just killing 1 or 2 infantry models that you're in base with. Could be fairly important if the tank's going to get locked up by them, or if you've just got a unit or 2 standing on objectives. For 1 or 2 CP, there's a bit of a boost to the Fire on My Position one. Previously this was a huge 3 CP and just not very efficient. Now it's 2 CP most of the time, and it's still the same Voxcaster is killed in melee. You roll a 1d6 for units within 3 inches, and on a 4+, they take d3 mortal wounds. Really quite an evocative one that. I think there's few things more guard than radioing in an artillery strike on your own coordinates, just as you're getting overrun. It's 1 CP on units with the Cult of Sacrifice regimental trait as well, so if you're playing that new version of Deathcore, then good news for them I suppose. Next up, there's a 1 command point for the extra Warlord traits and 1 CP for the extra relics. They follow the same patterns as in most codexes, and there's also one for Sergeant relics as well. You can give them either the Claw of the Desert Tigers, which we'll get onto in a second, the Barbican's Key, Emperor's Fury, or the Relic of Lost Cadia. I feel like out of those, the Barbican's Key is perhaps the most interesting one. That one allows you to teleport your infantry squad once per game. Potentially, I guess you could have something like a squad of Kazakin with some special weapons, and then have them jump across the board to a threatening position and hose something down with some hotshot lasguns. For 1 CP, we've got Maverick Maneuvers. This one's a Sentinel one for 6 inches move after shooting. Quite nice, and that's basically just a movement boost if you need it. You could basically have a Scout Sentinel move up the new 12 inches, shoot something, and then move an extra 6. It means that you could get to an objective a really long way away, or could help you out with things like move blocking, I guess. I guess in theory you could move, shoot, move, so you could shoot something and then hide out of line of sight as well if it made sense. It does appear that the big damage one for the Alpha Strike Sentinels on turn 1 is gone though. For 1 CP, we've got Thunderous Charge. These ones are mortal wound impact hits for either Ogren units or Rough Rider units. You get to roll 1d6 per model of yours that's in engagement range, and if you equal or beat the enemy's toughness, then they take 1 mortal wound. Kind of totally depends on the units charging and what they're charging into. Maybe it could be okay if you're going for really quite a big charge on something very tanky like Terminators with low toughness. It's going to be pretty rubbish on most things that are toughness 5 or higher though. For 2 CP, we've got Artillery Strike Request. This one's a command phase one where they have the sort of usual system of you place a marker on the board. You must have a Master of Ordnance or an Expert Bombardier officer. Not sure if that's something that we've already seen from previous leagues. Maybe it could reference a Warlord trait or a tank case or some other upgrade. In any case, it's the usual case of place a marker on the board. Your opponent has their turn to try and scoot out of the way of the incoming barrage, and then in your next command phase you have the chance to deal some mortal wounds. Every unit within 6 inches takes d3 on a roll of 2 to 5, and 6s do d6. Kind of like those new League's Death Strike rules. Perhaps not quite as much about dealing mass damage, but could be an annoying area denial thing. Still though, probably seems a bit on the niche side for 2 CP. Moving on, for 1 CP we've got Vicious Traps. A unit fully in area terrain gets a chance to deal mortal wounds when they get charged. Roll a 2 to 5 for d3 mortal wounds, a 6 for 2d3. And then there's quite a bunch of things that can give you a bonus to that roll. There's a +1 if you're a Katachan, or have the Veteran Guerrillas trait, or a +1 if you've got a Melter Mine that those new Kazakin have. And also, kind of hilariously, there's another +1 if Sly Marbo's on the board. To be fair, you really could be racking up quite a lot of those bonuses all on one unit. Potentially you could have a pretty hefty chance for the 2d3 mortal wounds if you do get charged. Seems interesting, probably going to be most useful if you happen to get charged by something like a character without that much health left. For 1 CP we've got Feign and Strike. Rough Riders get to fall back, then shoot and charge. From the previous league's profile it does look like Rough Riders really are going to be quite powerful. Having access to a fallback and charge thing does seem pretty nice, and it's a pretty good bonus that you also get to fire off with some lasguns or something as you're doing so. Quite nice in the way that your opponent can't reliably lock them down. For 1 CP there's Flak Barrage. This one allows a Hydra to intercept an enemy aircraft coming in from reserve and within line of sight, basically getting to fire a full round of shooting at them and hopefully deal some hefty damage. I feel that one's super niche to be honest. Not that many enemy lists use flyers in the first place, let alone put them in reserve. I feel like you're very rarely going to see that used. For 1 CP we've got Shield of Flesh. This one's the Bulgrim one from that Greater Good book. A unit of Bulgrins make 1 infantry unit behind them a -1 to hit if the Bulgrins are closer and within 3 inches of that same squad. A little bit underwhelming in my opinion. -1 to hit really isn't bad, but you have to be in quite a specific setup for it to happen in the first place, and I feel like there's probably not going to be that many infantry squads that are really worth protecting. Maybe if you've got some valuable Kazakin on the board or something, and they just happen to be in the right situation. I'm not sure that -1 to hit is really enough to build around though, because even if you have that, then they're still going to be winding up dead against mass anti-infantry fire. I guess theoretically, if Ogrin got good as well, then that could be interesting. Maybe you could have some Bulgrin shielding Ogrin perhaps. For 2 CP, we've got Mount Up. This allows a Mechanized or Militarum Tempestus units to shoot and then re-embark in a vehicle. I think the Mechanized is one of the regimental traits that you get, and that one allows to disembark them after moving, so it seems quite powerful that you could basically have them jump out, shoot, and then jump back into a vehicle to avoid any reprisals. At 1 CP, I feel like that will be really quite strong. At 2 CP though, I feel like it's just a bit much to be worth it, and probably isn't something that you'd really want to be building around too much. For 2 CP though, we've got Overcharged Las Cells, which I think is quite fun. You can use this for Kazakin and Scions. 6 is to wounds, deal 1 mortal wound with hotshot weapons, up to a cap of 6 mortal wounds out of a shooting phase. Really quite cool for the idea of las guns getting to deal a whole load of chip damage at the enemy like that. I guess we'd have to see at just how much numbers we can get out of hotshot las guns to see how worth it would be. For 2 CP, I'd hope that you'd be getting at least 4 mortal wounds out of it, but I guess in theory, if you had, say, a unit of Kazakin, maybe with those Lord Solar buffs that are rumoured, re-rolling to hit some wounds, then I feel like that will give you a pretty reasonable chance of hitting that cap. For 1 CP, we've got smoke launchers, a -1 to hit on vehicles with the keyword when they're shot, as per standard. Certainly doesn't hurt to have it as an extra layer of durability, and that will work a bit differently to how smoke launchers work at the moment. I guess for 1 CP that could be really quite interesting on the bigger tanks like the Rogue or Dawn and the Super Heavies, provided they get the keyword. For 2 or 3 CP, we've got Ablative Plating. This one's another very interesting damage debuff on big tanks, a -1 damage for a battle tank or an armoured superiority unit. A keyword that isn't one that we've seen, I think. I wonder if that might denote Chimera chassis vehicles. -1 damage whenever you need it though is quite a big deal. Could easily be worth the 2 CP depending on what your opponent's shooting you with. If they're about to hit you with a whole bunch of damage 2 or damage 3 weapons, it could well be the difference between life and death for a tank. It is a big 3 CP on the Rogue or Dawn or the Super Heavies though, so it's probably a bit too steep an investment on those, but on something like a Lehman Russ it seems pretty decent to me. Lastly, for the confirmed ones, for 1 CP we've got Meltamine, a keyworded unit when fighting a vehicle or monster rolls the dice. On a 2 to 3 you get D3 plus 1 mortal wounds on it, and on a 6 you get 2d3. You definitely get a Meltamine on that new Kazakin squad, so it could be interesting for the upgrade there to have a little bit of combat punch. It'll be interesting to see if it crops up anywhere else in the codex. Lastly, there's a trio of stratagems that apparently the name was leaked, but not the actual details, though to be honest, just from the name I think we could have a pretty decent guess. Battlefield Surgery costs 1 CP, and seeing as we know that there's a medic keyword in the codex, that seems almost certain to me to be a medic resurrecting dead guardsman. If it winds up being similar to the Votan stratagem, then that could be something like regenerating D3 guardsmen out of a unit. It might even be a bit more than that, given that guardsmen are fairly cheap and expendable. You might even get something like 2d3. There's also for 1 CP Orbital Interference. This one's another unknown one, but it apparently is an option for Officer of the Fleet. Just judging by the name again, it does sound like it's probably going to be something that messes with enemy reserves in some way. Games Workshop have unleashed a couple of stratagems that stop people coming in from strategic reserve in certain places, or ones that stop you dropping within a certain distance of some units. My guess would be that it's probably going to be one of those, with the provision that you've got the Officer of the Fleet on the board. Finally, for 1 CP, we've got Acceptable Losses. This one again is unknown and maybe a bit more vague. Could be something morale related. It could be something cool and disturbing like firing your artillery into combat with an expendable unit. I guess we'll wait and see for the codex for that one, and how much the officers and commissars feel about shelling their own men. Overall for stratagems, I don't really feel like it's a direct upgrade for Guard. I feel it's a bit more of a side grade. I feel like the extra power of the codex is probably going to come from the datasheets with the inflated stat lines and better weapons. Out of these ones, I feel like quite a few of them are kind of niche. Maybe out of ones that I feel like might be quite common uses, I feel like Vengeful Salute could be quite nice for destroyed Russes. Direct extra damage in the enemy turn can be surprising and ruin their plans. Overcharged Las Cells seems kind of interesting if you are spamming hot shots with the Scions or the Kazakin. Ablative Plating and Smoke Launchers both look very usable for trying to make your tanks tougher as they trundle around blowing things up. Quite nice to have some direct durability increases. Overall though, I feel like maybe the Guard Stratagem section has taken more losses than they've gained. I feel like things like Hail of Fire, Take Cover, and overlapping Fields of Fire would all be sorely missed if they are indeed gone. Otherwise, from the second major section out of these leaks, there's the Guard Relics, a section that we had most of them before, but apparently there's a bunch more, another 6 that were not mentioned in the previous set. First up out of these ones, there's the Claw of the Desert Tigers, a power sword with a +2 strength, AP3, damage 2, and +2 attacks. I must admit, out of the previous relic section, I was kind of surprised to see literally no combat relics whatsoever for the Guard, particularly after they had 3 different combat relics before in the previous codex. Stats wise, it does seem at least fairly threatening. The senior officers look like they're still going to be getting 4 attacks, so this would put them up to 6, strength 5, AP3, and damage 2. If you decided to invest in them a bit, it looks like they could be offering a couple of Space Marines in a turn. Like with the rest of the relics now, it doesn't look like they're restricted to any one regiment. This one used to be the Talon one, and could definitely be used to represent any different relic weapon that you happen to have in your lore. The next one is the Clarion Proclamatus. A Master Vox bearer in a command squad gets an unlimited order range for units with Vox casters, so you could have the command squad's order broadcasting across the battlefield to far-flung units. I'd guess that Vox casters are still probably going to be free in the new codex, though we'll have to see how that goes. It could certainly give you a lot more flexibility though, being able to position the units where it actually makes sense to, rather than have to cluster up around orders, so this one does look at least pretty interesting on paper. There's then a Relic Regimental Standard for a 6-inch aura to core units to ignore modifiers to hit and wound, and on top of that you also get to ignore any feel no pain and wound caps that the enemies might have. If this turns out to be a whole game thing and not a single turn thing, then it looks like that could be a really powerful shooting buffing relic. Ignoring modifiers really is quite big, as is cutting through Feel No Pain, and also damage caps for things like Abaddon the Despoiler or Catan. I would bear in mind though that it only seemed to affect core units, and at least from the leaks that we have at the moment, it looks like that's mainly just going to be infantry, plus maybe sentinels, so I don't think it would just mean that you'd be able to ignore damage or Feel No Pain caps with Lehman Russes and things. It looks like they aren't core. Still though, that looks like it could be at least fairly interesting for frontline damage dealers. If Kazakin do wind up being good damage dealers when all the rules come out, then it looks like it could be interesting for them. Perhaps could be good for heavy weapon teams as well, maybe things like mass mortars could be quite fun with this sat amongst them. How good it is though I think will depend on whether or not it's one turn or all game long. Next up we've got the Null Code. This allows you to deny power for a Tempesta Prime, and you get to add +1 to that denial roll. A little bit of Psychic Defense there, but it's not really all that hard to come by Psychic Defense Regard if you want. Psychers are at least relatively cheap, or you could put an Astropath in a command squad. The Emperor's Fury is a relic plasma pistol that's locked on overcharge mode, 3 shots at strength 8, AP -3 and damage 2 with no overheat. That doesn't seem terrible to be fair if you had a spare command point kicking around, and if you were using it on an officer that you're pretty sure is going to be near the front line. If you could get that firing for 2 or 3 turns, it's probably going to make back the investment, but still doesn't seem super vital for the functioning of the army, and is probably going to get left behind most of the time. Finally, we've got the Refractor Field Generator for the Tempestus Scions. This one used to be the Lambden Lions one, and is perhaps one of the most popular relics that they had kicking around, giving a 5+ invul save to Scion units within 6 inches. It still looks like it remains very good to be honest, that still works, but now only on infantry, not on vehicles. Seems like a pretty reasonable one to have around along a Tempesta Prime when you're escorting some dropping Scions from somewhere. A 5+ invul just seems like quite a big deal when you only have a 4+ save to start with. Otherwise, besides those 6, these are the previous relics that we talked through about the other league. Just to go over the pics of these, I feel like that Barbican's Key is quite interesting now. Having a teleporting infantry unit of some sort seems nice, and it could be something cool like Scions getting a first turn Alpha Strike. Otherwise, Gatekeeper looks like a pretty reliable upgrade. Strength 9 and AP -3 on a battle cannon. That appears to be an extra +1 strength and extra AP -1 compared with the league's profile for the standard version. And there's a few other interesting ones with orders like getting an extra one or issuing one in your opponent's turn, plus the Sigil of Sanction to allow you to know and cast 1 extra power. From the new set, maybe the pick of them are going to be that Clarion Proclamatus and Regimental Standard. They look like really good battlefield command buffs, and if infantry are capable of doing the heavy lifting in the Guard Codex and it's not all tanks, then they look pretty cool. Let me know which ones you think are standout though, and which ones are duds. So anyway, I think we'll leave that one there for today. Let me know what you make of the new stratagems and relics down in the comments, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll hopefully be covering a fair bit more of the League's Guard rules in the next few days. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.